Funding for To the Contrary provided by the Cornell Douglas Foundation, committed to encouraging stewardship of the environment, land conservation, watershed protection, and eliminating harmful chemicals. Additional funding provided by the Wallace Genetic Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
We've had a real problem with extending into what is protected speech. It might be offensive, but it's not harassment.
The average case is one where a woman has been sexually assaulted.
We are now not talking about something that I think everybody in America would recognize as a sexual assault or rape. We're talking about, frankly, ambiguous situations.
Welcome to the Contrary. I'm Bonnie Urbay. This week we continue our Women Thought Leader series with Inez Feltscher Stepman. She's a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum and a senior contributor to the Federalist, focusing on issues ranging from education to feminism. Welcome to the show, Inez. Very pleased to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with the education report card. Please explain to our viewers what it is and how you're involved with it.
So I worked with state legislators on a whole host of education issues. And every year I would put out basically a compilation report of some of the policies of each of the 50 states. We basically looked at state policy across 6 different categories. We looked first and foremost at private school choice. These are programs like tax credit scholarships, like opportunity scholarships, and most importantly to me, something new called education savings accounts, which are really, really flexible and provide parents with choice as to what kind of education and even individualized education for their children. The second part of that is charter schools. So charter schools, very, very popular form of school choice across 43 states and the District of Columbia. We also looked at homeschooling. We looked at teacher preparatory programs. We looked at merit pay. We looked at how different schools in different states are actually implementing technology in the classroom. So we looked at a whole host of different factors, and then we graded the states based on what policy they had in place.
How are charter schools doing?
I think charter schools are extremely varied, so it's hard to answer the question across these 43 different states. I mean, they definitely provide parents with an option besides the zoned public school, right? The vast majority of American children still attend the public school that they were zoned to by their zip code. And as we know, the Americans sort themselves very, very strongly by where they live, by socioeconomic status, even racially. We're still incredibly segregated in how we live. Providing charter schools it gives a second option to a lot of parents who only have one option, and that option may not be working for their kid for whatever reason.
How about Christian schools? You include them in charter schools, right?
No, so charter schools are public schools. The only difference is they're exempt from a lot of the rules and regulations surrounding public schools, especially regarding staffing or curriculum, but they can't have an alliance with a particular religion or a church or anything like that. They don't teach religion. Private schools, though, when you have private school options, private school choice options, those do include religious schools. So Catholic schools, non-denominational Protestant schools, Jewish schools, Muslim schools, and secular schools like the Montessori private schools, or Sidwell Friends, where the Obamas sent their kids in D.C. So private school choice programs provide parents with opportunities at all kinds of public, private, and including religious schools.
But explain to me, please, how it works with private schools, where the Obamas sent their kids is upwards of $30,000 a year. How does a child from a low-income family use federal support, if it's available, to go to a school like that?
The vast majority of private schools are not like Sidwell Friends. There are thousands and thousands of private schools in America that have tuition between $6,000 and $10,000. For example, the entire Catholic network of private schools, a lot of them specifically have it in their mission to serve low-income kids, so they tried very hard to keep their tuitions low. But on the flip side, in DC, we spend almost $30,000 per student in the public schools. So we actually spend an enormous amount of money in Washington, D.C., and we have some of the worst results in the nation, although they are improving.
Why is that? I mean, it only makes sense that if you can pay teachers more and give them better benefits and have better buildings with air conditioning, with heating, which a lot of public schools don't have even in this day and age. How is it that you could spend more?
We only hired as many new administrators as there were sort of proportionally new kids coming into the system. We'd be able to give all teachers something between a $3,000 and $5,000 raise tomorrow. In New Jersey, it's like $17,000 or $19,000 a year immediately. And that's not a hiring freeze on administrators, that's just keeping pace, right? Keeping the bureaucracy keeping pace with the way that students, the student population is increasing. So really, it's a priorities problem.
But is that something, for example, that happened under President Bush's massive reorganization of the whole teaching method, the whole public school education in this country when he signed the Leave No Child Behind Act?
Federal intervention into education in general, we still have to think about. It's only 10% of the funding. The vast majority still comes from states and localities. Going all the way back to President Johnson and the war on poverty, right, in the 1960s, turning on that tap of money led to building the Department of Education because we wanted to know where that money was going, a reasonable request. And then we wanted to know if the money actually worked, so Congress decided to attach all these carrots and sticks trying to get schools to improve based on federal money. That was No Child Left Behind. Then we had the current version of ESSA. Then we had Race to the Top under Obama. We had SIG programs. We've had all kinds of federal interventions. And every step along the way, the education system, in terms of the results, have either stagnated or gone down. And to me, that says what we need to do is actually stop doing these top-down interventions and go to parents, go to families, because they're the ones who actually know the best what their kids need. And oftentimes those needs are incredibly varied. I mean, anyone who has more than one kid will tell you, like, what works for Sally may not work for John, and vice versa. Each kid is different, and therefore their education needs are different. That's why I think we need to change the system to empower parents rather than trying to keep forcing these reforms from the top, from the federal government, which really don't have a good track record.
How much does immigration, in a sense, language have to do with problems in the public schools? I live near a magnet school in Virginia where the kids speak 84 languages. Doesn't it hurt, hold back some other kids' education if a teacher has to teach a child who speaks Arabic or Armenian in English?
Absolutely, and the challenges of teaching such a diverse population, and America has always been a diverse country, in fact, not just with regard to languages, but with regard to family background, with regard to ethnic background, with regard to values and what families believe. We've always been an incredibly diverse country. And that's why this very one-size-fits-all traditional public school system that we basically haven't touched since the mid-1900s does not serve the diversity of America well.
Should a public school system have to take care of all those different needs that the students have, on top of the fact that a lot of low-income kids don't really come from a functioning family? Is it possible that a public school system could do well for all those children?
Well, I exactly think that it can't, as long as we have a single monolithic system, right? As long as we're trying to serve everybody in all of their challenges, diversity, and needs, and on the flip side, all of their strengths and the things that they're individually good at or interested in. As long as we're trying to serve everybody, we're going to serve everybody kind of poorly.
But what about privatization? Are you in support of privatizing public schools?
So when people say privatization, they mean allowing parents to take the public dollars, right? So every kid has a certain pot of money that's earmarked for that kid, right? By whatever funding formula that exists at the state level, compounded with federal and local money. Every kid has sort of a dollar amount associated with him or her in the public school system. Right now, that amount of dollars goes directly to the public school, regardless of whether or not that school is actually serving that kid well, regardless of whether the parents think that that school has values that align with theirs or is doing well for their kid's education. So I actually think privatization is sort of, it's used as a scary word, like, oh no, we're not going to get rid of public education. No one wants to get rid of public education.
With private schools, that takes money out of the federal budget. Aren't you, in essence, privatizing with charter schools and with schools, specialized schools like the one you're talking about in Florida?
I would say what those dollars are now following what the parents want them to do. If the parents want to send their kid to the traditional public school that's right down the street, they will do that, and those dollars will continue to flow. What it's flipping who holds the power. Right now, bureaucrats and politicians have decided, okay, your dollars are allocated here, you're in this zip code, therefore your kid will go to this school. What we're saying instead is not to privatize the system, and in fact, I would say that public investment in education is a common good. I think conservatives, liberals, everybody in between can agree. This is a public good. We absolutely want to invest in our kids' educations. The difference is how we invest, right? And whether we allow parents and families to choose how that investment will be spent, or whether we allow bureaucrats or sort of the technocrats in Washington and in another big federal program, or state politicians to decide how that money is spent.
School choice opponents would say that that's really a coda for saying, let's take tax dollars away from the public school system. And privatization, you work for ALEC. ALEC is
previously, yeah.
Very much behind the American Legislative Exchange Council, very much behind privatization of prisons, of parking meters, of state toll roads, etc. And Education Secretary DeVos's family has made literally billions of dollars from supplying the needs of privatized schools, or partially privatized schools. Do you agree with that, or are you saying that's all wrong?
I can only speak in education to the policies. We absolutely supported school choice, which, as I said, I don't call privatization because there's still public dollars, right? We're still investing. If we talk about the public as taxpayers, as citizens, right? Our citizens are still investing in the education of our future generations, and I think that's really, really important. The difference is how those dollars are spent. And I think we have to separate the idea from this one system, this traditional public school system that's been around for about 100 years in America, that doesn't have a great track record of educating all students. And I think we have to separate the idea of that particular system with its monolithic sort of structure from the public investment, I would say, from the public dollars. I absolutely believe and continue to believe in investing in public education. The difference is, what does that public education look like, and who holds the power? Is it parents, or is it administrators or bureaucrats or politicians? And I would say that's actually a more democratic way to invest in public education. It's to trust families to know what's best for their family.
What would you do about that? I mean, you have a choice of either taking money out of the districts where well-to-do parents have worked hard to get their students into, or leaving things as they are where poor kids aren't getting a fair shot at a good education.
I don't think those are the two options. I think the best option is to actually restore that funding and the decisions about that funding to the family level, to the student level. And that's why I think choice actually has so much promise for, it's not going to be a silver bullet, right? It's not going to magically transform education. It's not going to magically transform some of the deep class divides in America. I'm not going to try to pretend that that's going to happen. But what it will do is loosen that link between where you were born and the family in which you were born and the quality of education that you have access to. Because instead of having to be assigned to a particular school in your particular neighborhood, you will have choices, you'll have options. Either there's a charter school maybe a mile away, or there's a private school choice program that provides scholarships to go to a private school.
All poor kids are not going to be able to get into charter schools, with excellent standards under what you're saying.
The choice, first of all, the competition created by each family being able to control the dollars actually increases the quality of education for everyone. So some of the least known facts and studies about the whole kind of school choice debate are those on traditional public schools in areas where there's a school choice program, right? So in areas where potentially some students might leave the traditional public school, use a school choice program to attend a private school. 22 out of those 23 studies that looked at the schools and the students who were left behind, right, did not have access to the choice program because these programs aren't universal usually, unfortunately in my opinion, but usually they aren't universal, saw actual academic improvement in the school where the kids left from. And the 23rd one just showed no effect. It just showed null effect, right? So what we're seeing is, in fact, even by allowing just a few students to access choice, we're realigning the incentives where parents actually have a lot more power, can go to a school and say, you know what you're doing right now isn't working for my kid. And that competition between schools for that parent's decision actually lifts all the boats and improves education for everybody.
What would you do about violence in schools?
It's been an increasing problem, right? In the last about 4 to 5 years, we've seen a lot of, statistical increases in violence within schools. For example, in schools that had more than 10 suspensions per year, per academic year, we've seen in the few studies that we've done in the last few years, we've seen big increases, and again, per district.
Inner city schools, or are they mainly rural schools?
So for example, in Parkland, the shooter, unfortunately Nicholas Cruz, right, he had a very long track record of doing things that, you and I would say, of course, somebody should be not only suspended, expelled, but they should be referred to law enforcement, right? He made real threats on campus, he brought weapons to school. And because of these sort of new programs that really don't want to, so they make schools have incentives not to want to record suspensions, expulsions, or referrals to law enforcement, he slipped through the cracks. He had no criminal record. Teachers were looking at serious discipline violations that really ought to have been taken seriously. But the top and the sort of bureaucracy filtering down turned what was a well-intentioned idea into something that was quite dangerous.
What about arming teachers, which is a conservative push right now?
I'm in favor of the Second Amendment. I'm in favor that if somebody, is able to get a concealed carry permit in their state, I have no problem with teachers being able to arm themselves and defend their students. But that's kind of I see it as a little bit of a periphery issue to education in general. It's definitely a Second Amendment issue. It feeds into the debate the country is having over gun control. But I don't think that that's going to be the core of a school safety issue one way or another.
Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, you're a supporter. She's extremely controversial. What do you think about her changes to Title IX, which was set up to protect alleged victims of sexual assault in schools? And she would shift the burden and make it much easier for predominantly male students accused of sexual assault to present their cases to school administrators.
First, I think we need to back up and recognize that the changes that the Obama administration put into place, which is what we're talking about rolling back now, really didn't work.
Tell me what those changes were.
Those changes lowered the standard of proof, for example, to preponderance of the evidence, which is just more likely than not, allowed all kinds of, in my view, deeply unfair and anti-American in some ways, and by that I don't mean like the general, but anti-American principles of jurisprudence, right? So to have, for example, something called a single investigator model, where one person, one administrator, does all the investigating, asks all the questions, right, and then renders a verdict. That's very, very, very different from what we're used to in American jurisprudence, okay? So, and frankly, encourage schools to set up what have been increasingly something close to kangaroo courts, right? And we know that they have had deep constitutional problems and deep legal problems because the men who were quote unquote convicted in them oftentimes sue the schools and win in actual federal court afterwards.
So why not then just start a movement to have these allegations reported to local police and prosecuted by the local criminal justice system as opposed to by school administrators?
I actually think that's a fantastic idea. Look, there are problems with trying to prosecute sexual assault, and I recognize that there are a lot of victims who say that it's extremely hard to convict somebody in a court of law, that maybe there should be a lower standard on campus. I think that's a reasonable debate to have, but there is no doubt that the criminal justice system is set up much better to deal with this kind of case in terms of the resources they have access to, in terms of being able to put people under oath to testify, and frankly, to have the investigatory powers of the police. Schools don't have any of those tools, and they're particularly ill-suited for dealing with this problem. But if they are going to deal with this problem, they have to do it fairly.
The problem is that they are ultimately legally responsible for anything that happens to their students. So you would have to change, common tort law and place the burden on the public and on the public judicial system.
This is actually something that Betsy DeVos, the proposed changes out of the Department of Education, deals with, the jurisdiction of Title IX, which originally was more narrow than it has been treated for the last 5 years or so. Right? Because originally Title IX was supposed to deal exactly with campuses, things that schools could control, right? They weren't considered liable for the behavior of their students, off campus, during the summer, on a trip to, wherever, just because they attended the school during the rest of the year. So I think one of the proposed changes that Betsy DeVos has put forward to Title IX is actually very reasonable, which is, look, schools can't possibly be responsible for everything that anyone even remotely connected to their school has done on their free time. The other changes that she's proposing are things like getting rid of that single investigatory model that I think is deeply unfair. The same person shouldn't be asking the questions and then making a ruling. That's not the fair system of finding the truth. One of the more controversial changes she made was to reintroduce a requirement for cross-examination. The Supreme Court has called that the greatest legal engine for discovering the truth. And contra to some reports, that doesn't mean that the accused student gets to cross-examine the person who's accusing him of sexual impropriety. That does not happen. In fact, they can be in different rooms. They can never be in the same room if they choose to do it that way. But it does mean that anyone who gives a statement is asked questions about that statement and then asked to, for example, corroborate facts and to bring forward evidence and all of these things. And cross-examination is a great tool for that. So she reintroduced that. And finally, one of the things that I think has gotten not enough coverage, that I think maybe is something that we can find some common ground between the left and the right, is the narrowing of the definition of harassment. So schools have had these kind of ever-broadening definitions of what harassment means on campus, and sometimes that cuts into protected speech under the First Amendment. So for example, there was actually a liberal feminist teacher whose presentations, she used some curse words in her presentation. She's a tenured professor. She's I think she was an arts professor, and it was part of sort of how she taught. And there were Title IX claims, harassment claims filed against her by students in her class saying that she was harassing them with the language that she was using. We've had a real problem with extending into what is protected speech. It might be offensive, but it's not harassment, right? The Supreme Court has defined harassment in a case called David versus Monroe. And they've laid down the marker for what that is. It's objectively offensive behavior, which is a standard a court used, not just what might offend any particular person, but some kind of reasonable standard for what's offensive. And it has to be so severe and pervasive that it actively prevents a woman from accessing the education to which she has a right.
Okay, but you're really talking about cases that are way on the margin. The average case is one where a woman has been sexually assaulted, not even just harassed.
So it's very difficult to talk about these average cases and what they mean on these campuses, right? When we hear statistics like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 women has been sexually assaulted,
in their lifetime.
So on campus.
Right.
Those surveys are including tons of women, and when we're talking about averages here, 70 to 80% of the women who those surveys count as sexual assault victims do not consider themselves sexual assault victims. Because as a society now, we have incredibly expanded what these words mean, well beyond their legal definition. We are now not talking about something that I think everybody in America would recognize as a sexual assault or rape. We're talking about, frankly, ambiguous situations between where both parties are heavily intoxicated, where consent is either assumed or wasn't proper. We're talking about very, very gray area cases. If you want to talk average, those are the average cases. They're not cases in which what you and I would think about as very clear sexual assault or rape cases. Those cases often do go to the police, in fact, because in those cases, evidence is able to be collected, and the criminal justice system has a much easier time dealing with those cases. This whole system, in a way, is set up to try to deal with these ambiguous cases that, as a conservative, I would argue what we've done is we've taken all the guardrails off of male-female interaction, and then we've tried to jam back the rules via sort of legal consent, which I just don't think has been working very well.
For people, grown-up women who aren't still in school, but something like 2% of them are false. Do you think men really need more protection?
So that number actually comes from a speech from one judge 30-something years ago, that 2% number, but it's repeated.
I thought it
all
was
over
from Justice Department case
So those
data.
are, first of all, the Justice Department data is talking about federal crimes. Most sexual assault is not a federal crime, it's a state crime. But we don't actually have a great handle on what the false report rate might be. And then there's the majority of cases where you can't prove it one way or the other, right? So we can't say, for example, that 2% of these reports are false, when you can also say on the flip side, only something like 3% of people who are ever accused of rape are convicted, right? In the middle, there's all the things that we're not sure about. So it's not like, I don't think that number is really a fair number to work with. And I absolutely think that the principles and things like presumption of innocence in our justice system, they protect all of our rights when we're accused of anything, right? It's not just men who are protected by the presumption of innocence. Women are protected by the presumption of innocence as well. This is a principle in our justice system for a reason.
Thank you so much. You've been a fascinating guest, and I appreciate your expertise on this issue. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/to the contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.